Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to talk about this government's plans to impose a cashless debit card on 23,000 people in the Northern Territory. We have a long experience of compulsory income management in the Northern Territory. On the 21st of June 2007, the Howard Government announced a national emergency response to supposedly protect First Nations children in the Northern Territory from sexual abuse and family violence. I was then the member for Arnhem in the Northern Territory Government, a seat that represented mainly Indigenous communities. The emergency response, or the intervention as we call it in the Territory, was certainly a blunt instrument that slammed into Indigenous communities, demonising and disempowering First Nations people. There was certainly no discussion and no consultation, and overnight First Nations people in the Northern Territory lost control over their lives. Compulsory income management, the lime green basics card, was a measure introduced to the Northern Territory under the intervention. It applied to 73 communities in prescribed areas of the Northern Territory, associated outstations and 10 town camp regions. The compulsory income management measure was meant to reduce discretionary disposable income by quarantining 50% of all Australian government income support and family assistance payments, and the then CDEP wages for an initial period of 12 months. According to the explanatory memorandum for the relevant bill at the time, the primary aims of income management were to stem the flow of cash that is expended on substance abuse and gambling, to ensure funds that are provided for the welfare of children are actually expended in this way, and to protect vulnerable people from financial exploitation, including the practice known, as we call it, humbugging. The original legislation introducing income management contained provisions that limited the application of the Racial Discrimination Act and anti-discrimination legislation. The legislation and the intervention generally treated people differently on the grounds of race. The overwhelming majority of people subject to income management in the Northern Territory are Indigenous. 12 years later, even though the basics card provisions were extended to urban, regional and remote areas of the Northern Territory, it is still the case that the majority of Territorians with a basics card are Indigenous. Similarly, the government's proposals to impose a cashless debit card will overwhelmingly affect First Nations people in the Northern Territory. First Nations Territorians are still dealing with the ramifications of the intervention, and it is really important that the Senate and the House of Representatives are very aware of the concerns that are really emerging in the Northern Territory around the whole debate with the cashless debit card. It is quite difficult to describe the impact because it has happened well over a decade. As I said, I was a member of Parliament. I was certainly the member for Arnhem at the time, and as a parliamentarian, I certainly felt powerless and voiceless at the time as the Howard Government rolled out these measures. So if we in the Parliament in the Northern Territory Parliament at the time, felt disempowered, just imagine how the First Nations people and constituencies felt. So in rolling out the intervention, it did have control over the smallest decisions that people could make. The Army certainly came into communities. People were scared. They were worried their children were going to be taken away again, and men in particular were demonised as pedophiles. It was scarring, it was debilitating, and the end result only seemed to increase dysfunction and disconnection in remote communities. Senators, when you take away people's abilities to make decisions over their lives to look after their families' interests, to govern their communities, to decide what to spend their money on, it has a deeply profound effect. Remember, compulsory income management doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a system which now includes CDP, the Community Development Program, and that is designed to disempower First Nations people. Whether we like to hear that or not, that is actually the reality on the ground. And disempowerment leads to anger and often to hopelessness. To impose a new system of compulsory income management across the Territory on people who've already been subject to this experiment is certainly going to reveal, in particular as we travel across the Territory, is certainly going to reveal the real depths of how people feel. And it is important that our committee, the Community Affairs Committee, is going to travel to listen to the concerns that people are going to raise. The majority of people affected by this change, approximately will be 79%, will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander income support recipients. So I'm sharing with the Senate that after 12 years of having the system under the Northern Territory Emergency Response or Intervention imposed in the Territory, there is little evidence compulsory income management results in widespread or long-term benefit. And that evidence is not only academically, but we will certainly hear anecdotally, and it's certainly something I see consistently in my work across the Territory. I've been hearing from many Territorians since the government flagged they want to introduce a cashless debit card. They're certainly very angry that they've not been consulted, but as I've pointed out to them, our committee will be travelling certainly in the Northern Territory at this particular point in time, to hear from them. And I do urge people across Australia to make sure that you put in your submissions to our committee. But that anger is there, and the realisation that they do want to be heard, and not only heard, but have their concerns legitimately followed through. The Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance NT CEO John Patterson said the cashless card proposal makes a mockery of government rhetoric around Aboriginal controlled decision-making. Mr Patterson said this feels like the Howard-era intervention all over again. And this directly opposes recent commitments by the federal government and COAG to work with us in partnership on closing the gap. But again, I reiterate that whilst I certainly know those concerns are out there, it is important that our committee hears quite clearly from everyone. The Arnhem Land Progress Association, a strong Aboriginal controlled organisation with successful enterprises under its umbrella, is very concerned at the negative effect it will have on your communities. Keith Lapulang of Milangimbi, who's the director of the Arnhem Land Progress Association, or ALPA, said the card will add to the negative effects of the intervention in our communities, not only taking away people's control over their lives, but by making it harder for small Indigenous businesses who may not be able to accept the card to survive. Again, this historical context is going to be quite critical, Madam Acting Deputy President, to our committee as we travel. ALPA have direct experience with a system that actually works. The ALPA food card is a voluntary family budgeting tool. Customers can choose to have money paid into the food card at any time and then spend that money over the remainder of the pay cycle on a selected range of food and household essentials. Why do I mention this? Because the food card assists by voluntarily protecting money people want to put for food from pressures from other non-essential expenditure. It is a system that is working, it's voluntary, and most importantly, it was developed on community by community as a solution to some of the issues they identified. I certainly ask the government to take a new approach, listen to First Nations people and communities in the Territory who have innovative ideas and solutions to these issues. If a community genuinely wants to use this cashless debit card, then they should be properly consulted with and provided with the necessary supports. Labor is not opposed to income management in all circumstances, but we're opposed to the broad-based compulsory programs that ensnare and disempower all people.